UNICEF has been pushing for schools in East and Southern Africa to open. What are your thoughts given the South African experience?
Well, in South Africa, we never, as NAPTOSA or even the other unions, mind you, advocated for the permanent closure of schools. We always believed that schools should open under the right conditions. And so we are in fact happy. And we've shared our experiences with our Kenyan counterparts. We've shared our experiences across East Africa and also West Africa through EI, the Education International, where we've explained the route we've been through and why we believed that we ought to open. So we actually support the view of UNICEF that we have to open schools at some stage. They can't remain closed. But of course, the conditions need to be right in order to do so. And I've heard from your reporter that it appears as though Kenya is doing the same thing that we did in terms of safety protocols, etc.
All right. Are you happy that in South Africa that we have followed those protocols and that school learning is going as well as it can?
We're happy to a certain extent. Remember, there have been many gains, but also there have been many fights. And we constantly have to check that the quality as well as the quantity of these PPEs are there, because our people are still full of fear. We see that by the fact that almost 20% of learners still haven't returned, some of them because parents are just keeping them at home. But insofar as what is happening in our schools, our teachers have been working flat out. And of course, it's been a difficult road, countering their own fears, their own stresses and strains, and of course the people at home, but also the whole matric issue, where we have many teachers spending extra hours after school, over weekends, to try and get those syllabi completed. So there's a lot happening in our schools, and all in the best interest of education and the education system.
All right, so we're talking a little bit about what you've shared with countries like Kenya, but what interventions have you had to learn on the job, as it were? Once the schools were opened, yes, there were protocols that were put in play, but often it's the proof is in the eating of the pudding. What things have you seen on the ground that you could only have seen once the kids got back into the classrooms?
Peter, we often think of schools as having many little darlings there, and in a measure they do. However, the little darlings don't always listen, and parents had this tough time of discovery when they were sitting with the learners at home. And social distancing is a real challenge, not so much in the classes, but outside, and when the learners leave school. And that has been a constant challenge. And of course, for the little ones, ensuring that the masks have been brought. Schools now have a battery of additional masks, and it's a little tough because these things run out. The department doesn't readily supply extras, and schools have had to make a plan. So things like social distancing has been difficult. But of course, there are marvels as well, where children have fallen into the pattern of hand washing. They've fallen into the pattern of standing in certain lines, and they've fallen into the pattern of cleaning their desks, etc. Those are the things that are learned activities which have now become ingrained in most schools. However, the challenges of schools that are inappropriate, where facilities aren't good, where water supply is erratic, those are the things that we are battling with at this stage. But we've had a lot of support from parents, and parents, of course, are fearful in themselves, but so too are the teachers. So it's been a learning curve of how to work together, how to support one another, and of course also to calm, especially the children, down, because they too suffer from the same stresses and strains as the teachers and parents.
All right. Have you had reports of infections and getting a sense of any kind of infection rates at the schools?
Peter, but for that massive infection outbreak at a school in the Eastern Cape, there have been no major outbreaks. Yes, there are still people falling ill, but it's ones and twos. Schools are microcosms of society, and with the number of infections in the broader communities decreasing, so too has it done in schools. The days of schools sporadically closing seem to have ground to a halt. We hardly ever in the last month have seen schools closing. Rather, we've seen isolated incidents. There are children falling ill. Just today, I spoke to one of our colleagues in the Northern Cape, and there they had 3 incidents at a particular school. But the norm is that it has really decreased. And we hope that this will be the pattern. Of course, we have fears. We have fears like the whole country has, that our scientists are telling us that we need to be cautious about January, February after the festive season. And we are worried about the impact that is going to have on schools, infection rates, our teachers, etc.
All right, so your colleagues in the region perhaps are not as well resourced as some of our schools here, and even here the schools are very different in terms of being resourced. So when you compare the resourced and under-resourced, what's been the difference that perhaps the less resourced countries on the continent can learn from?
Well, for one, in South Africa, we have a similar pattern in a smaller setup where some of our schools are very well resourced and some of our schools are very poorly resourced. But even our poorly resourced schools in South Africa, by comparison to state schools or public schools in Kenya, for example, are pretty well off. And what we have shared with them is the plans we've made in terms of assisting learners, for example, who are at home, because we have the pattern of only 50% of the children being at school at a given time. Those schools that I'm making reference to don't have the technological assistance and technological devices to assist their children, and neither do the children have. And how we've done workbooks and how teachers have sat together to compile additional little work to ensure that even on the off days, the children are not just roaming around. And these are the things we've shared. But of course, even then, it's difficult because accessing duplicating paper in some of the far-flung areas further up from Nairobi are much more difficult than we can possibly imagine. So whilst we have troubles, we have to acknowledge that our troubles sometimes are not as great as some of our neighbors. And yet we are still not in the place where we believe we should be. So a lot has been shared, and especially also in terms of dealing with infections in schools, and whether what we did at the beginning when there was summary closure of schools was the right thing, and what we learned to do. And we shared with them our documentation, like our standard operating procedures, and how we've worked through that. And these were gladly taken. I can't claim that they have been used or adapted, but they certainly took them to have a look at them as well.
All right, so all of the countries in the region, schools have lost a lot of time, a lot of the educational year has disappeared. How is catching up? I believe that South Africa is going to start the new calendar year much later than normal.
Peter, there are some things that we have to accept. 2020 was not a normal year. We always knew that there would be deficits when we reached the end of the year. But what we were sought to achieve was to have a credible amount of work so that progression can take place. We could assess the learners. But now, of course, we are very busy working, and of course we bumping heads on how we do the catch-up of those core parts of the curriculum which were not covered in this year. As an example, if you were in grade 6 and you move to grade 7 and there were core concepts from the grade 7 mathematics, grade 6 mathematics that you didn't do. You have to do them in grade 7. But how do we pile that into grade 7 without impacting on the quality of teaching and the sheer volume of work? But there too then lies the next challenge, to trim that curriculum to ensure that it is covering the core and not the extension. So there's a lot of work happening currently behind the scenes. And yes, it is a tough one because we are all looking to 2021 and 2022 to catch up. But that's easier said than done, because if the child is in grade 11 going to grade 12, you don't have the luxury of an additional year to catch up in. It must be done in next year. And we've got to ensure that those children are equipped for the matric exam of next year, assuming, of course, that we are not going to have the disruptions we have this year. So we still have to plan for disruptions also, because we can't be blind to the fact that we could have a disrupted start. So there are many challenges, many scenarios, and we are far from getting to the point of saying we have now got the plan in place. We are at the starting blocks, literally.
Yeah. I mean, even if a vaccine comes, it's going to take quite a while to totally recover the system. How much time have you given yourself, do you think? Let's assume a vaccine comes early January, to get back to a place where we were before the virus?
Peter, it's a very difficult one, because getting back, first of all, is to reach a point where we are all comfortable that the entire school cohort can come back. Then, of course, we've got to deal with those very, very vastly overcrowded schools, and there are a number of those. Then, of course, once we get back there, normal teaching can happen, and we are not losing every day, because the scenario we have at the moment is that we're constantly losing a day or two, because only 50% of the learners can be there at a given time. Then the big challenge is to find the other learners. What has happened to 20% of our children? Some of them we know have dropped out, but can we afford to let that happen? And we assume conservatively that it'll take 3 years before the backlog is eradicated, provided that there are no major school closures in the new year. If that scenario takes place, it may even take longer. But there are those who don't have the time because they are in grades nearing the exit, and that is where the biggest challenges lie. The pressure on teachers is enormous. When teachers are pressurized, parents are pressurized as well. And so we have this vicious cycle of psychosocial pressures being piled on teachers and parents as well. But besides the support we need to give, there's very little else we can do but to steam on ahead and ensure that we start picking up the pieces.